Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Edward. So today, in the next about 25 to 30 minutes, I'll be sharing with you a little bit on what I guess Nutanix is, as well as what we can offer in terms of digital transformation in retail. So I do know the word digital transformation is kind of a cliche because it's been mentioned so many times by so many different technology vendors. But I just wanted to give a little bit of perspective from where we are. So without further ado, let me just go a little bit into the agenda. So today I'll be quickly covering a little bit of what we are, is in the company's profile, as well as the retail industry. What trends do we see in the retail industry, as well as maybe some of the use cases that we have observed while talking to our customers, right? I'll share a little bit on what are the solutions that we can offer, as well as maybe last but not least, one customer success story. Hopefully that's the customer that everybody can relate to from a branding or brand name perspective, right? So without further ado, since I only have about 25 minutes, let's begin. Nutanix, right? For those of you that's not aware, haven't heard of us, what's Nutanix, what company or what do they do? We are primarily an IT infrastructure provider. We are a software company. And I think one of the important things that I would really like to mention is the vision, right? From a vision perspective, we are planning, right? Or rather, we are aiming to make clouds invisible. I'm sure that you have heard quite a fair bit of clouds, the various flavors of the clouds today, right? So we want to make them invisible, right? Not because they cannot be seen, right? But rather more because they are easily managed. They run without you needing to worry about, how they work, right? Freeing our customers to focus on business outcomes, right? So our mission is, of course, to read off the slides, is to delight customers with a simple, open, hybrid, multi-cloud software architecture, right? Which various data services to run any application, right? So giving a little bit in perspective, right? So I think this is a topic that a lot, if not everyone, has on their minds, right? The impact of the pandemic on retail sales, right? I think 2020 has really been quite a challenging year. Not just for retail, for everybody, right? Including, even IT vendors, right? We've been forced to adopt to, radical new ways of working. The customers can only do Zoom sessions nowadays, either Zoom or Teams or WebEx or whatsoever. There's no face-to-face, everything has to be done remotely as much as we can. I think particularly maybe a little bit more relevant towards the retail sector, right? I think the retail sector have really felt the impact in terms of, brick and mortar shops, right? Nobody is allowed to go to them. Everything is now shifting online, right? Of course, there are some retail e-commerce shops that have benefited quite a fair bit from this change. But I think majority of us, right, with the challenge in terms of traffic, is really challenging, right? And of course, the supply chain. So in terms of the trends, right, of course, this is with observation, with some of the various vendors or the IT, analysts, right, and as well as talking to our customers, right. So a lot of the retail customers that we've been talking to, right, has started to evaluate a hybrid cloud model, right. So maybe they were traditionally on-premise only, so they've also started exploring moving on partial of their workloads to the cloud, like Amazon and Google, right? So retail is also further along, right, based on the analysis, right, in cloud enabling its data centers and public cloud. Because again, there's not a lot of choice, right? Once the pandemic started, a lot of the retail customers have to actually shift or pivot their businesses, right, to doing more online, right? Because the traditional ones were no longer available. So in a way, it was kind of forced, right? So we also see that the pandemic has actually raised the profile of IT, right, within the retail customers, right? So they are now expected to do a lot more, right? So a lot more, not just in terms of servicing internal users, but also helping to transform the business in terms of how do I engage my customers nowadays, right, through IT, okay? So that's kind of the more macro trends that's been going on. So in terms of digital transformation in what we call the new, and everybody likes to call the new normal, right? Even in Singapore, in this part of the world, Even the government has been encouraging us to look beyond, what is the old and what we can do in the new normal. I think digital transformation is really the key to enable and optimize a lot of resources and delivery in order for businesses to remain competitive. Right, some of the emerging trends that we can see, right? So I'll start from the left, omni-channel, right? I think this is a word that has been mentioned quite a fair bit of times, and I'm sure everyone, if not all of you, right, have heard of this, right? Omni-channel. How am I able to engage all my customers across the different channels, not just in terms of the traditional brick and mortar, when we talk about foot traffic, how do I attract more customers to walk into my shops, right? So I'm now engaging customer on multiple channels, right? For example, on the digital front, right? How am I enabled to engage my customers on social platforms, right? For example, on Instagram, on Facebook, so on and so forth, right? How can I personalize those experiences, right? When they come and engage with us digitally, right? Do I want to provide a virtual shop? Do I want to enable a better customer experience, right? In terms of, how they engage with me, right? How can I make my store smarter? And how can I enable a more digitized end-to-end connected digital supply chain? So these are all the emerging trends from a digital transformation pertaining to retail industries, right? So if I were to break them down in terms of, specific activities, right, that the customer will actually do, right? So I think a lot of times, right, when we talk about this thing we call customer journey, customer experience, right? So if we talk about customer journey, you're talking about things like, how do we browse items? How do they search items? How do I make it more intelligent, right? In order for the customers to get to what they want faster, right? Today's customers today, right, they expect a lot more from the platforms, right? They don't want to go through a website or something like that and click like 10 or 20 clicks in order to get to where they want, right? I have to make it easier for them to get to where they are. Today's customers' patience or attention span are way shorter, right? How do I make the customer experience shorter, right, or better? By enabling profiling, by, doing competitive pricing, and what are the promos that I want to push to the appropriate customer segments, as well as the campaigns that I want to use, right? So from a infrastructure perspective, right, how do I enable all these things, right? How do I make my e-commerce site better, right? In terms of customer journey, customer experience, smart stores, and things like that. So all these things actually require IT to be a lot more agile today, right? Rather than, for a customer journey, I get to go to vendor A, from another customer experience, I got to go to vendor B, and, all these things, right, are not able to gel with one another. For example, vendor A will ask me to do this in terms of e-commerce. Vendor B will ask me to do another thing, right, for another thing. Right? So all this needs to have a holistic view as well as strategy in terms of approaching all these things. I think whether be it on the public cloud, whether you're using a solution for the public cloud, or whether you are hosting that on premise, or whether you're doing a little bit of both, I think in terms of strategy, that is really important to have a good strategy moving forward on how to enable all this so that all these things are easily managed as well as easily pushed out, right? And doesn't put a strain on IT, right, to deal with more and more different vendors, right, in order to get this done. So from that perspective, going into the use case scenario, when we talk about omni-channel, we are trying to understand demand, right? So at the back end, right, what is needed to support an omni-channel perspective? Like I said, I mentioned things like, engaging with digital platforms, engaging with social media. A lot of these social media platforms are now opening up their API stacks, right? So there is quite a fair bit of things that I can ask a potential Facebook or Instagram to do, right? But the thing is, whatever they can be done, do I have the capability to process all this information and the information that Facebook or Instagram is going to throw to me to enable me to respond to that? That actually requires me potentially, right, to have a good DevOps service at the back end in order to process all this information, right? So if we jump to things like immersive experiences, right? How do I give a better customer experience for my, potential user? So one of the things that, potentially comes to mind is, maybe having a VDI environment, right? For the customer, to have a more immersive experience, right? Moving on to things like even smart stores, right? Smart stores can potentially be another immersive experience, But from that perspective, then I need to look at things like Kubernetes, cloud native services, right? CI/CD infrastructure as code, right? Moving on to even digital supply chains, right? So we are even talking about things like IoT and edge services. So all these things span really across a very wide stack of technology, right? So in order to be able to holistically drive this, right, what Nutanix really wants to offer is this, right? So when I talk about earlier on the things like DevOps, desktop services, right, hyper-converged data center services, so all these things can be actually be managed from a single platform. We can have the ability to run any application and potentially to run on any cloud that you choose, right? Whether be it be Amazon today or Azure in the future, or I prefer to just keep some of that on premise, right? So this is actually a single platform that we offer, right? In terms of all these things, right? Whether I want to do more analytics, to analyze the information from Facebook or Instagram coming in so that I can push out appropriate promotions and platforms, right, to all those different customers that I engage. Okay, so this is kind of a quick summary, right? I know that it's really high level, but I really encourage you guys to think about this, and reach out to us if, there are any questions that you have. Okay, so this is the trends. These are the use cases. These are the solution offerings. How can I adopt? So the next question is, how do I start planning to adopt? Okay, so from an adoption perspective, we actually provision a very, very simple three-stage or three-phase approach. Okay, whether you're on your legacy infrastructure, right? So this is a very good example of what you typically have, right, in an enterprise class data center, right? You see your virtual machines, right, based on traditional VM platform. You have things like, VLAN, subnets, you may have your traditional database servers, application server, web servers. They are all deployed on your standard server architecture or your storage architecture, things like that. So this was your legacy, what used to be, right? As phase one, right, we call it a infrastructure transformation, right? What we actually recommend to do is you transform all these things into a more agile platform in terms of hyper-converge, right? With hyper-converge, I'm actually able to reduce the footprint in my data center, right? As well as being able to scale, right? Scale node by node, or rather server by server, rather than buying big chunks of, infrastructure or hardware to come in to support all these things, right? So that's what we call by fractional consumption. So this is actually phase one, whereby you start to change the internals of your data center to be able to be more agile and responsive. Okay, having adopted phase one, okay, we move on to the next phase of the transformation, which we kind of start looking at the workloads or the software itself. How do I transform that? Now that the backend hardware is transformed, so let's look at how to transform the front end. Okay, so from a workload transformation perspective, so I talked a little bit about cloud native, in order to leverage more newer technologies. So these are the things that we can potentially look at, containerizing some of the applications, right? Instead of deploying them on virtual machines, okay, I can start looking at Kubernetes, containerization, Dockers, so on and so forth, because these are all used by all the cloud native platforms, okay? So this is one of these. And of course, by looking at modernizing your databases as well, I can have a database as a service rather than doing traditional databases, right? Like your typical Oracles or, your typical SQL servers. I can actually start looking at modernizing them by looking at database as a service, still leveraging potentially Oracle if you want to, or I can look at some newer databases platforms like, open source like Postgres, MariaDB, so on and so forth, right? For them to come in and start to complement your infrastructure. Okay, and potentially, right, even with a operations platform, right, I can have the ability to start securing them, right? Security is a very big topic nowadays because there are more and more, companies. I'm sure that you have heard of things like ransomware and things like that. So we have to start protecting ourselves, by creating security zones, right? Then we can automate all these security zones, inside a Nutanix environment, whereby we can also help to automate and protect, okay, and start to analyze as well as manage all these things. Because again, now I'm doing on a fractional consumption. I need to know when potentially all my resources is going to run out of resources. I need to plan that like 6 months down the road, 3 months down the road, 1 year down the road. right? So these are all things that, you know, typical IT looks at, right? So after phase 2, right? So the next phase of the transformation is potentially, right, you know, looking at, you know, leveraging public cloud services. So inside here, I have in my slides potentially AWS as an example, right? So we all know that potentially, right, Amazon has a rich suite of services that I can utilize, right? You know, things like Kinesis, SageMaker, you know, you talk about things like serverless, functions as a service, you know, which potentially some of your, you know, vendors that are helping you with omni-channels, helping you with, you know, smart stores are using, right? So you can actually help support this by making your infrastructure available for these vendors to use, you know, and integrate, you know, by leveraging all these public cloud platforms, right? So the advantage of leveraging a Nutanix perspective is I have the ability to burst, you know, or engage from a public cloud perspective, all these services while maintaining these services on your on-premise as well. So we call this a hybrid cloud transformation, right? The ability to have workloads on-premise as well as in the public cloud, right? I think without going into a lot of details, I think leveraging on the learnings that, you know, the public cloud, some of the early adopters of public cloud, we all know that public cloud today, right, in terms of TCO ROI may not be the best, right? Especially if you want to go all in on public cloud, right? So we have a couple of high visible examples that we have already learned this lesson. So I think learning from this lesson, we know that a hybrid cloud model whereby I do my on-demand workloads in the public cloud, my more seasonal workloads or my more predictable workloads on premise, that actually gives you the best TCO ROI, right, in terms of managing TCO ROI. Okay, so this is the public cloud or hybrid cloud or multi-cloud model that I think a lot of people are embarking on, right, especially within the last 1 to 2 years, because we have all learned that, you know, it's never good to go all in on one or another, right? So this is where Nutanix can potentially help you, right, with helping you to extend that flavor from the public cloud to internal or internal to public cloud. Having said that, right, I've shared a little bit on, you know, how we help customer transform in leveraging the earlier 3 phases. But I also want to stress, right, I think different customers are already embarking on the journey, and you may be at different stages of the journey, right? Maybe you are already at phase 2, or you may already be at phase 3, some form of phase 3. So it's not to say that, you know, I must go through a 1 to a 2 to a 3, right? I can actually start my modernization journey at any phase, right? And I can actually do it at any phase. You know, we can actually come and help you at any phase as well, right? It doesn't mean that if I'm already at phase 3, you know, there's no need for me to start looking at, you know, how can I optimize, or I already skipped phase 1, right? Can I start this modernization journey, right? The answer is no, there's no need to, right? So we can actually help you at each and every stage of your journey, right? Do reach out to us to have a check. So having said that, right, so this is primarily, I guess, the solutions that we have to offer, right, as well as sharing with you some of the 3-phase journey that quite a fair bit of our customers have embarked on. So with that, I really wanted to share with you, right, besides, you know, hearing from Edward, right? So I think one of the other things that, you know, a lot of people want to look at is hearing from our customers, right? So I wanted to share a journey. I'm sure this name, if you are not familiar, this customer is called Shinsegae, right? I hope I pronounced it correctly, right? They are primarily one of the biggest retail or, you know, departmental stores in South Korea, right? I think to touch on a little bit, they've already started adopting Nutanix, right? If you can read from there, right? One of their architect team managers, right? So they really like the ease of management, right, as well as the high performance. I think one of the important things, right, for what I mentioned earlier, right, in terms of helping customers, I think in terms of features and functionalities or the overview or what we can offer, I think quite a fair bit of customers, I think all the IT, you know, vendors that you speak to today is going to offer you some form of that, you know. But I think the good thing about Nutanix, right, is the ease of use, right? Because we are relatively young vendor, so we understand the pains that, you know, traditional customers have to deal with traditional IT vendors. So we have really tried to design our solutions, right, with the objective of making it simple to adopt, right? So there isn't a very steep learning curve, right, in order to switch to a Nutanix solution, right? So I think that's one of the key value propositions that really Nutanix provides for you, right, in terms of switching to our solution. So with that, I also want to run you through a brief video. With that, let's look at the video. Oops, sorry about this. Let me reshare the screen. Some technical issues.
리테일 산업은 정말 빠르게 변화하고 있습니다. 새로운 쇼핑 경험을 제공하기 위해 최신 IT 기술이 가장 빠르게 적용되는 분야입니다. 특히 신세계는 IT 기술을 유통 접점에 가장 성공적으로 적용하고 있는 대한민국 최고의 리테일 그룹입니다. 리테일은 365일 24시간 무중단으로 운영되어야 합니다. 이전에는 명절에 시스템을 하루 정도 중단하고 업데이트를 해야 했습니다. 전 시스템의 60% 이상을 누타닉스로 변경하면서 무중단이 가능해졌습니다. 관리 유연성이 확보되었기 때문입니다. 각 유통사업장의 특별 시즌에는 트랜잭션이 예측하기 어려울 정도로 상승합니다. 신세계 면세점의 온라인몰 캠페인이나 문화센터 수강 신청 시즌이 대표적입니다. 신세계 INC는 2012년에 프라이빗 클라우드 서비스를 런칭했습니다. 그리고 2016년부터 누타닉스 HCI를 기반으로 서비스를 고도화했습니다. 신세계 INC는 고객사에 가장 안정적이고 효율적인 프라이빗 클라우드 서비스를 제공하고 있습니다. 그룹사의 프라이빗 클라우드를 관리하는 신세계 INC의 엔지니어들은 누타닉스 AHV 프리즘 기술 덕분에 장애를 최소화하고 업무 효율을 높일 수 있게 되었습니다. 미래 클라우드 전략의 일환으로 2019년 오픈한 김포 IDC는 SDDC로 설계되었습니다. 무지하층 설계, 일체형 냉동기 도입 등 최첨단 설비를 갖춘 가장 안정적인 데이터 센터입니다. 새로운 데이터 센터에 누타닉스 기술을 적용한 것은 가장 핵심적인 계획 중 하나입니다. 데이터 센터 이전 과정을 국내 최고 수준의 가상화 무중단으로 진행한 것도 의미 있는 결과였습니다. 신세계 INC는 미래 클라우드 전략을 본격적으로 실행할 것이고 진정한 리테일 테크 기업이 될 것입니다.
So I know that just now the language was in Korean, right? So, but I think there are English subtitles at the bottom. So hopefully you have already seen and read from those subtitles. So I think one of the key takeaways, if I may, right? So Shinsegae has started the journey. Again, one of the key things that I really want to reiterate is the ease in terms of adopting the technology. So also the assistance in terms of day one, day two operations, right? So in the past, they had to deal with quite a fair bit of downtime, right? So they also mentioned in a key point that retail business today runs 24/7, right? At least for them, right? So they really have, very small windows for downtime. And by adopting the technology, they actually reduce quite a fair bit of, the downtime or the planned downtime that they needed in order to manage the environment, right? Okay, so with that, that's the end of my sharing. So I would like to take the chance to open up to questions. So let's open for questions.